get ready for a wild ride. This is the story of an HOA that messed with the wrong kid. You won't believe what happens next. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss a single twist and turn in this incredible courtroom drama. The Henderson family, Mark, a dedicated software engineer with a quiet intensity, Sarah, a vibrant freelance graphic designer juggling work and family, and their 10-year-old son Ethan, a bright and sensitive boy diagnosed with autism, sought a fresh start in the meticulously planned community of Willow Creek. The brochures promised a life of tranquility, perfectly manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, and a strong sense of community, all overseen by the watchful eye of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA. What the brochures didn't mention was the HOA's iron grip on conformity, a rigid adherence to rules that would soon clash violently with the Hendersons' lives. Ethan, like many children on the autism spectrum, found the world overwhelming. Bright lights, loud noises, and unexpected social interactions could trigger intense anxiety. His therapist had recommended a sensory swing, a specially designed chair that provided gentle rocking and a feeling of enclosure, helping him to regulate his sensory input and find a sense of calm. The Hendersons carefully installed it in their backyard, tucked away behind a screen of flowering bushes, believing it wouldn't cause any issues. They were wrong. Within weeks, a formal letter arrived, embossed with the imposing Willow Creek HOA logo. It cited Article 7, Section 3, Subsection B of the Community Bylaws. No structures, temporary or permanent, shall be erected in rear yards without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. The sensory swing, deemed an unapproved structure, was in violation. Mark and Sarah were stunned. They immediately contacted the HOA, explaining Ethan's needs and the therapeutic purpose of the swing. They provided documentation from Ethan's therapist, highlighting its importance for his well-being. Their initial attempts at communication were met with cold indifference. The HOA secretary, a stern woman named Patricia, simply reiterated the rule, her voice devoid of empathy. Mark and Sarah requested a meeting with the Architectural Review Committee, hoping to reason with them face to face. The committee, a collection of longtime Willow Creek residents, was led by the formidable Mrs. Deborah Huntington, the HOA president. Mrs. Huntington, a woman who seemed to have personally drafted every bylaw and enforced them with an almost religious fervor, epitomized the community's obsession with appearances. The meeting was a disaster. Mrs. Huntington, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and steely gaze, dismissed their concerns out of hand. "Rules are rules, Mr. Henderson," she stated, her voice dripping with condescension. "We can't make exceptions, or where would it end? Next, people will be putting up inflatable swimming pools and trampolines." Other committee members, a mix of retirees and stay-at-home parents who seemed to derive their sense of purpose from enforcing HOA regulations, echoed her sentiments. One, a man named Mr. Abernathy, even suggested that Ethan's condition might be better managed elsewhere. Sarah, usually calm and collected, felt a surge of anger. "My son's condition, as you call it, is not a choice, Mr. Abernathy," she retorted, her voice trembling. "The swing is not a recreational toy, it's a medical necessity." Mark, seeing his wife on the verge of tears, tried a different approach, appealing to their sense of community. "We're all neighbors here," he said. "Surely, we can find a way to accommodate Ethan's needs without compromising the aesthetics of the neighborhood." His plea fell on deaf ears. The committee voted unanimously to deny their request, citing the potential for precedent and the negative impact on property values. The Hendersons were left feeling defeated and increasingly angry. They had moved to Willow Creek seeking a supportive community, but they had found themselves trapped in a web of inflexible rules and blatant prejudice. Unbeknownst to the HOA, however, a silent observer had been meticulously absorbing every detail of this unfolding drama. Ethan, often overlooked and underestimated due to his quiet nature, had developed an unusual coping mechanism. He found solace in structure and order, and the HOA bylaws, with their precise language and intricate cross-references, provided him with a strange sense of comfort. He had begun reading them, initially out of curiosity, but soon with an almost obsessive focus. He memorized entire sections, tracing the convoluted logic of each rule and regulation. He didn't understand the social nuances of the conflict, the unspoken biases and power dynamics at play. But he understood the rules. And in his quiet, methodical way, he was beginning to see a pattern, a loophole, a glimmer of hope that nobody else had noticed. The HOA, in their arrogance and disdain for Ethan's difference, had inadvertently armed him with the very weapon that would ultimately be used against them. The seeds of a courtroom showdown were being sown, a battle not just for a swing, but for acceptance and understanding, with an unlikely hero at its heart. Ethan began noticing inconsistencies. And the HOA was far from noticing. This mistake would bring a surprising ending to their perfect neighborhood. Ethan started to underline important articles. Desperate and feeling increasingly isolated, Mark and Sarah decided to seek legal counsel. They found Ms. Jennifer Johnson, a young, ambitious lawyer specializing in disability rights and discrimination cases, through a local advocacy group. Ms. Johnson, with her bright eyes and a genuine passion for justice, listened intently to their story, her initial sympathy quickly turning to righteous indignation as she reviewed the HOA's correspondence and the bylaw documents. "This is outrageous," Ms. Johnson declared, tapping a pen against the stack of papers. "They're clearly discriminating against Ethan based on his disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA) protects his right to reasonable accommodations, and a therapeutic swing in his own backyard certainly qualifies." She explained that while HOAs have considerable power, they are not above the law, and their bylaws cannot supersede federal anti-discrimination statutes. Ms. Johnson outlined their legal options, which included filing a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, and pursuing a lawsuit against the Willow Creek HOA. She warned them that it would likely be a long and arduous process, and the HOA, with its deep pockets and experienced legal team, would fight them every step of the way. Mark and Sarah, however, were resolute. They were not just fighting for the swing anymore, they were fighting for Ethan's dignity and the principle of fair treatment. As Ms. Johnson began gathering evidence and preparing her legal strategy, she spent time getting to know the Henderson family, including Ethan. She noticed his quiet demeanor and his tendency to avoid direct eye contact, typical characteristics of his autism. He often sat silently in the corner of the room during their meetings, seemingly engrossed in his own world. One afternoon, however, while Ms. Johnson was discussing a particularly complex section of the HOA bylaws with Mark and Sarah, Ethan suddenly spoke up. "That's not entirely accurate," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Article 7, Section 3, Subsection B, which they're citing about the swing, has a cross-reference to Article 12, Section 1, Subsection C, which deals with exceptions for medically necessary assistive devices." He then proceeded to recite the relevant passage verbatim, his memory flawless. Ms. Johnson, Mark, and Sarah were stunned into silence. They looked at each other in disbelief. Ms. Johnson quickly retrieved the bylaws document and flipped to the section Ethan had mentioned. He was absolutely correct. There it was, in black and white. A seemingly obscure clause that provided a clear exemption for medical devices, provided they met certain criteria regarding size and placement, criteria that Ethan's swing easily satisfied. "Ethan," Ms. Johnson asked gently, "how did you know that?" Ethan, slightly flustered by the sudden attention, simply shrugged. "I read it," he said. "I've read all the bylaws. Many times." He explained in his matter-of-fact way that he found the rules comforting and that he enjoyed memorizing them. He had noticed the cross-reference weeks ago, but he hadn't understood its significance until Ms. Johnson started discussing the legal case. Ms. Johnson realized that they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. Ethan's unique ability to memorize and understand the complex web of HOA regulations was not just a quirky hobby, it was a potentially game-changing asset in their legal battle. She began to question him further, testing the limits of his knowledge. He knew the bylaws inside and out, not just the individual articles and sections, but also the intricate relationships between them, the subtle nuances of wording that could make all the difference in a legal interpretation. The HOA's legal counsel, a seasoned lawyer named Mr. Robert Thompson, known for his aggressive tactics and meticulous preparation, had likely never encountered an opponent like Ethan. He was accustomed to dealing with emotional arguments and subjective interpretations of the law. He was not prepared for a child with autism who could dissect the bylaws with the precision of a seasoned legal scholar. This discovery completely changed the dynamic of the case. Ethan was no longer just the subject of the dispute. He was an active participant, a key witness, and potentially the Henderson's secret weapon. The courtroom showdown was looming, and the balance of power had subtly shifted. The HOA, confident in their authority and their meticulously crafted rules, were about to face a challenge they had never anticipated. This discovery gave Ms. Johnson new confidence. This boy was about to school them all. The initial shock gave the family hope. A spark in a dark situation thanks to Ethan. This changes everything, thought Ms. Johnson. A boy with autism versus a seasoned lawyer. The irony, almost comical, filled the room. Ethan, the underdog, holding all the cards. The HOA completely oblivious, walking into a trap. The courtroom, a stage for an unexpected drama. The day of the court hearing arrived, filled with a palpable tension. The courtroom, a sterile and imposing space with high ceilings and dark wood paneling, was packed with residents of Willow Creek, a mix of curious onlookers and staunch HOA supporters, many of whom had been personally recruited by Mrs. Huntington. Mark and Sarah sat nervously at the plaintiff's table, their anxiety amplified by the presence of Mr. Thompson, the HOA's formidable lawyer, who exuded an air of confident superiority. Ms. Johnson, despite her relative youth, projected an air of calm determination. She had spent weeks preparing for this day, meticulously crafting her legal arguments and, most importantly, working with Ethan. She had initially been apprehensive about putting a child with autism on the stand, especially given the potentially hostile environment. But Ethan, in his quiet and unwavering way, had reassured her. He wasn't afraid of the courtroom or the HOA. He was focused on the rules and he was confident in his knowledge. The hearing began with Mr. Thompson presenting the HOA's case. He painted a picture of Willow Creek as a community dedicated to maintaining high standards and property values, arguing that the Hendersons' refusal to comply with the bylaws threatened the harmonious aesthetic of the neighborhood. He called Mrs. Huntington to the stand, who testified with her usual imperious demeanor, emphasizing the importance of uniformity and order. She described Ethan's swing as an eyesore and a blatant violation of the rules. Mr. Thompson then called several other residents, all carefully selected by Mrs. Huntington, who echoed her sentiments, complaining about the negative impact the swing had on their property values and the overall look of the community. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy with prejudice, a subtle but unmistakable undercurrent of disdain for Ethan and his different needs. When it was Ms. Johnson's turn to present her case, she started by establishing the legal framework, citing the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act, emphasizing the Hendersons' right to reasonable accommodations for Ethan's disability. She presented evidence of the swing's therapeutic benefits, including reports from Ethan's therapist and doctor. Then she called Ethan to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom as he slowly walked to the witness box, his small frame almost swallowed by the large chair. He sat calmly, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze steady. Ms. Johnson began by asking him simple questions about his autism and how the swing helped him. He answered in a clear, concise manner, explaining his sensory sensitivities and how the rocking motion helped him to regulate his emotions and focus. Then Ms. Johnson shifted her questioning to the HOA bylaws. She led him through a series of carefully chosen questions, guiding him to reveal the crucial cross-reference between Article 7, Section 3, Subsection B, the rules cited by the HOA, and Article 12, Section 1, Subsection C, the exemption for medically necessary assistive devices. Ethan recited the relevant passages verbatim, his voice unwavering. He explained, in simple but precise terms, how the swing met all the criteria for the exemption, citing its size, placement, and therapeutic purpose. He even pointed out a subtle inconsistency in the HOA's interpretation of another section, Article 5, Section 2, which dealt with landscaping regulations, demonstrating that the HOA had selectively enforced certain rules while ignoring others. Mr. Thompson, initially dismissive of Ethan, began to realize that he had underestimated his opponent. He attempted to cross-examine Ethan, trying to confuse him with complex legal jargon and leading questions. But Ethan remained calm and focused, responding to each question with a clarity and precision that belied his age and his condition. He didn't get flustered or intimidated. He simply stuck to the facts, citing the specific articles and sections of the bylaws to support his answers. At one point, Mr. Thompson, growing increasingly frustrated, raised his voice and accused Ethan of cherry-picking the rules to suit his needs. "You're just a child," he sneered. "You don't understand the complexities of these regulations." Ethan looked directly at Mr. Thompson, his gaze unwavering. Article 1, Section 4, Subsection A, he stated calmly, defines member as any resident of Willow Creek regardless of age. And Article 15, Section 7, states that all members have the right to understand and interpret the bylaws. He then proceeded to dismantle Mr. Thompson's argument point by point, citing specific clauses and cross-references that the lawyer had clearly overlooked. The courtroom was silent, except for the occasional gasp of astonishment from the spectators. Mrs. Huntington sat rigidly in her chair, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. The HOA's carefully constructed facade of authority and control was crumbling before their eyes, demolished not by a seasoned lawyer, but by a 10-year-old boy with autism who had simply memorized their own rules. The judge, who had initially seemed skeptical of the Hendersons' case, was now leaning forward, listening intently to Ethan's testimony. It was clear that the tide had turned. The power dynamic had shifted, and the HOA was on the defensive. The audience was speechless, witnessing this. A child outsmarting a seasoned professional. The HOA's smugness replaced by shock. Mrs. Huntington's face, a picture of defeat. The courtroom buzzing with disbelief and awe. Ethan, the unlikely hero, shining brightly. Justice seemingly within reach for the Hendersons. After Ethan's devastating testimony, Mr. Thompson attempted some damage control, but his arguments sounded weak and hollow. He tried to portray Ethan as being manipulated by his parents and Ms. Johnson, suggesting that he had been coached to memorize specific sections of the bylaws. But the judge, clearly impressed by Ethan's genuine understanding and unwavering composure, dismissed this line of reasoning. Ms. Johnson, in her closing statement, reiterated the core principles of the case: the right to reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities, the importance of inclusivity, and the dangers of unchecked power wielded by HOAs. She reminded the court that the bylaws were meant to serve the community, not the other way around. The judge delivered his verdict swiftly and decisively. He ruled in favor of the Hendersons, declaring that the HOA's denial of the sensory swing was a clear violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. He ordered the HOA to immediately approve the swing and to pay the Hendersons legal fees. He also issued a stern warning to the HOA, reminding them of their obligation to uphold the law and to treat all residents with fairness and respect. The courtroom erupted in applause. Mark and Sarah hugged each other, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Ethan, seemingly unfazed by the commotion, simply smiled slightly, a rare and precious expression of joy. Ms. Johnson, beaming with pride, gave Ethan a high five. The aftermath of the ruling sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the case, hailing Ethan as a bylaw prodigy and highlighting the HOA's discriminatory practices. Several residents, emboldened by the Hendersons' victory, began to speak out against the HOA's overreach, citing other instances of arbitrary rule enforcement and petty grievances. Mrs. Huntington, facing mounting pressure and calls for her resignation, reluctantly stepped down as HOA president. The Architectural Review Committee was disbanded, and a new, more inclusive set of bylaws was drafted, with input from all residents, including those with disabilities. The community, once defined by its rigid conformity, began to embrace a more diverse and welcoming atmosphere. Ethan, initially unaware of the larger impact of his actions, became a local hero. Other children with autism and their families reached out to the Hendersons, seeking support and advice. Ethan, though still shy and reserved, found a new sense of purpose in sharing his knowledge and helping others. He even started a small bylaw club at his school, teaching other students how to understand and navigate complex rules and regulations. The sensory swing, once a symbol of conflict and division, became a symbol of hope and acceptance. It stood proudly in the Hendersons' backyard, a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of understanding, and the unexpected brilliance of a young boy who found his voice in the most unlikely of places. Mark and Sarah, forever grateful to Ms. Johnson and, most importantly, to their son, continued to advocate for disability rights and inclusive communities. They realized that the battle they had fought was not just about a swing. It was about creating a world where everyone, regardless of their differences, could feel safe, respected, and valued. The community learned a valuable lesson. Inclusion and understanding triumphed. Ethan, a true champion, changed his world. The Hendersons, finally at peace in their home. Willow Creek transformed for the better. A story of justice, resilience, and hope. The power of one to make a difference. The swing, a symbol of victory and change. And so, the story ends with a smile. The perfect neighborhood, with a perfect ending that shows the HOA's actions. This thanks to Ethan and a wonderful family that never let go, the Hendersons. Did Ethan's story inspire you? Join our community of engaged viewers who love stories about overcoming the odds. Subscribe now and let us know in the comments what you thought of this incredible courtroom showdown. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life.